Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Farmer Takes a Wife. Chapter 1. Carrie Brown never had an easy life. She was one of the Civil War orphans who never knew her family. The only life she did know was one of strict study, work, and prayer at the Arthur Hill Children's Home in Maryland. It was the place she called home for 16 years. Since that time, she'd been working as a maid for a wealthy, connected family who lived further north in Washington, D.C. One night, when the family was expecting a very important guest, she was putting in extra hours yet once again. There was no telling who it was, and Carrie did her best to keep her head down and appeared to pay no attention to the goings-on. The other servants in the house were all abuzz, however. "Did you hear? A senator tonight," said Lily, a pretty young maid. "Oh? You don't say?" "Which one?" asked Rachel, another maid. Carrie said nothing but stayed within earshot. "They say he's got a good-looking son," said Lily. "Well, I'm no match for you, dear." Rachel laughed. You never know. Maybe he'll take a shine to ol' Carrie, here." Lily sniggered. The two had a good laugh at Carrie's expense, but still, Carrie said nothing. She simply went about her chores in the next room. It did no good to stand up for herself, as she was the lowliest maid in the house. 'Cause trouble, and she'd be out in the street with no reference. This wasn't the first time the two chose her as a punchline. Carrie assumed she was plain, but the truth was she was beautiful. Beautiful and poor. Looks were never a consideration for her. She pulled her hair back in a severe bun and wore sturdy dark dresses. Even so, her symmetrical face glowed with youthful perfection. Many were the times that men, young and old, had turned to look at her, but she barely noticed. Survival was her aim, and anything beyond that was a waste of energy as far as she was concerned. Once she left the room to clean the coal buckets and hearths elsewhere, she occupied her mind with future plans. Just over a month ago, she had taken a precious moment to herself and contacted the Heavenly Doves matchmaking service. All her life, Carrie had been beholden to others for her subsistence, and she was constantly reminded of this fact. Once a month at the orphanage, the girls were scrubbed clean with ice-cold water and trotted out to give thanks to their patrons. On occasion, potential adoptive parents were there as well, but all the orphan girls knew they wouldn't be parents as much as employers. If adopted, the orphans would enter into a contract until the age of 18. At that point, they were to be given 2 sets of clothing and a paltry amount of coin, nothing more. Had they been boys, their pay would have been 3 times as much. Carrie feared that potential future. She preferred the guaranteed education and training she would receive in a trade at the orphanage. It wasn't exactly warm and homey, but it was practical. Being practical had been drummed into her from the time she'd arrived as a mere child at the age of 2. By the time she left, she could read, write, figure, sew, and perform several skills requiring dexterity should she choose to work in a factory. The day Carrie began work at her present employer's home was memorable, to say the least. She wore one of the dresses she made for herself just before she left the orphanage and carried her diminutive suitcase to the front door. When she rang the bell, the butler answered, looked down at her from his unusual height, and said, "Servants enter in the back, miss." She should have known. Terrified that she'd ruined her chances, she walked as fast as she could to the back. This took her several minutes. The front of the house was formal, manicured, and intimidating to Carrie. The back entrance was still manicured, of course, but it had no frills. This set her more at ease. This was a world she knew. As soon as she reached the door, Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, answered. She was getting on in years, and the decades of hard work showed in every line and shadow of her face. "You're late." "That won't do. Can't have an unreliable scullery maid," she said. I came by the front and was sent to the back, said Carrie. What I'd do a fool thing like that for? Go to the front? Never mind. You come highly recommended, though goodness knows why. Well, come on. Don't just stand there, gawkin'. Hope you can clean better than you speak. I speak just fine, ma'am. I also clean very well. Give me the tools, and I'll show you. Humph. You got a spine after all, girl. Fine with me, but don't cause trouble, you hear? Ever since that day, Carrie felt she needed to prove herself. She worked harder than anyone else and never complained, yet no one ever said a word to her. In the scheme of things, a scullery maid was invisible. Even so, there was no need to give anyone a reason to cut her loose. Lily and Rachel had given her plenty of grief over imagined wrongs. Carrie knew it was just their way to feel better. They weren't happy about their station in life, but at least they weren't scullery maids. It didn't do any good to waste time focusing on the past, however. There was an important letter from Heavenly Dove's matchmaking services waiting for Carrie in her tiny room that was just big enough to fit her saggy bed, bureau, and hooks for her 2 dresses. The furniture had once been a part of the house, but after it had seen serious wear and was no longer fashionable, it was moved to the servants' quarters. Once it was too worn for the regular servants, she received it. The lady of the house loved furniture, so this happened with some frequency, but Carrie's bed was ancient. Thin and light as she was, when she lay down to sleep, her head and feet were higher than her bottom. It made her back ache, but she figured it was better than sleeping on the floor. Carrie was still thinking about her letter when she finished cleaning the last of the fireplaces. It was time to brush herself off and start the last-minute touches for the family's important guests. All the servants were bustling about right up until the guests arrived. As soon as the bell rang, the 3 young maids hustled out, ran up the stairs, and peered down at the visitors. The man who was surely the senator was dressed in an impressive suit and sported finely coiffed black hair that was just beginning to turn silver around the edges. His wife was several years his junior, and her dress was of the latest fashion. The maids were about to turn away, but Lily pointed to the door. Sure enough, the senator did have a handsome son. He must have been about 20 years old. Oh, he's the finest dashfire man I've ever seen, whispered Lily. What would it be like for him to kiss my hand? Why don't you go find out? Rachel giggled. I have a better idea. Let's send Carrie to find out, said Lily, and she gave Carrie a little shove. They had been standing at the top of the stairs, just below the top landing. It was hard to know if Lily meant to cause serious mischief or not, but the results were a disaster. Carrie hadn't been paying attention. She was only there to stay on the other maid's good side. Her mind was really on the letter sitting in her room, waiting for her. Before she knew what to make of it, Carrie lost her footing and slipped down the stairs to the landing. She stopped in such a way that when she looked up, the senator's son got a good look at her face. Not sure what happened, and not sure if she'd seriously hurt herself, Carrie lay there, stunned. It was only for a few seconds, but of course, time had stopped. As the butler rushed to help her to her feet, she couldn't help but notice that all eyes were on her. Rosy flames of fear and shame consumed her face, body, and soul. This was it. She was finished. Sorry, sir. This clumsy maid shall be dealt with. I shall return shortly, said the butler. I am sorry, said Carrie, looking down at her hands. There was an awkward pause, but the senator's son jumped to her defense. Surely, everyone has had a clumsy moment, he said. No need to throw her on the streets for it, is there? What is your name, miss? And my name? He laughed, but she sensed he wasn't laughing the same way Lily and Rachel did. I'll help. My name's Edward. May I have yours? There's no need, interrupted the senator. I insist, said Edward. You're making her uncomfortable. I'm trying to make her more human, father. My name is Carrie, sir, Carrie blurted. See, that wasn't so hard. Good evening, Carrie. Now, please, since that's settled, let's move on, shall we? Said Edward. The party moved on to the dining room, and Carrie hobbled up the stairs. She would have bruises, to be sure, but at least she hadn't broken anything. Why on earth had Lily done that to her? That was a discussion for another time, however. The letter in her room awaited her. Chapter 2. Clarence Harris was a practical man in all respects. He had just enough shirts and pants to be respectable, but no more. His home was modest, but clean. His farm was large, but not obnoxiously so. He employed 3 young men and a cook from town to help him, and he paid them a low, but in his mind, fair wage. As soon as his bride arrived, he would let his cook go, thereby saving himself money. Even his decision to marry was based on practicality. He was in his late 20s, he had no debt, his farm was doing well, and it was time to raise a family. That was what proper men did. Besides, if his wife gave him good, strong sons to help with the farm, there would be no more need for farmhands at all. He once told his mail-order bride agent, Margaret, that love's for people who don't need to work for a living, and he meant it. Love wasn't practical, as far as he was concerned. Marriage was business. The sun had just passed the high point in the sky, and the corn was looking good so far. It was early in the season, of course, but still, he was satisfied. Nebraska was always humid in the Landy City area, but it was tolerable in mid-May. Rather than gaze about at the beauty of his green fields, Clarence scanned for signs of his lazy hands. When at last he'd caught sight of them, he let out an ear-piercing whistle to let them know it was time for the midday meal. Lazy lads. Won't answer when I call for them to work, but come runnin' when it's time to eat, he grumbled. Hey, Mr. Harris, shouted a freckle-faced boy named Tom. Time for supper already, said Robert, another boy, no older than 14. I'm comin' fast as I can, yelled baby-faced Harry. Clarence grunted in reply and followed the boys inside. Once they all bolted into Clarence's house and sat at the table, supper was ready to go. The food was never outstanding, but it was hot, brown, and sufficient. It filled them up, and it was cheap. These were the only requirements Clarence made to his cook. It never occurred to him that food could be more than these things. As he and the boys shoveled it in, he only gave them half an hour to eat. There was little in the way of table manners to get in the way. His cook didn't approve, but she had given up saying anything years ago. There was no point. It was the job she wanted. What they did with the food was their business. A few days before, Clarence received a visit from Margaret Roberts. It was a day like any other, and he was peeved when he saw her walking up the road. It meant an interruption in the day's work. She walked right up to him, a flush of excitement in her cheeks. Good day, Clarence. Morning, was all he said as he continued to hoe a particularly stubborn patch of weeds. I have news. I think I've found a bride for you. Are you interested? He dropped the hoe and looked her in the eye for the first time since she'd arrived. Course I am. It's why I hired you. Is she healthy? Yes, she's young, healthy, and... She a good worker? Yes, but... That's all I need to know. Send for her. The sooner, the better. It's customary for the prospective bride and groom to write a few letters to each other before meeting. It guarantees a good match, Margaret continued. Don't have time for that. If she's interested in a practical man, I'm satisfied. I'm not a doe-eyed boy, Margaret. Got to be practical in this world, you know. Now, anything else? I suppose not. Do you want to see her picture, at least? She offered a photograph of Carrie to Clarence. Something strange happened to him when he saw her. There was a feeling in his chest he was unaccustomed to, and he wasn't sure if he liked it. Maybe it was indigestion. She's an attractive sort. Yes, she is, Clarence. I thought seeing the photograph might inspire you. Good day. I'll send word when I know more, she said. Chapter 3. The butler went about taking care of the guests, but the look on his face as he departed made Carrie question any weight Edward's words might have carried. She hoped against hope that the letter addressed to her contained good news. Her agent at Heavenly Dove's matchmaking service was Margaret Roberts. The two ladies had been corresponding through the mail, since Carrie could never take time off from work to go to the local office. The last time she heard from Margaret, it sounded like a match had been found. The only question was whether Carrie was amenable to the match. Of course, she was. It really didn't matter to her who the man was. If he was sober, made a decent living, and wouldn't abuse her, that was enough for her. Lily and Rachel were nowhere to be found as Carrie headed up the back stairs to the servants' quarters. This didn't surprise her, they weren't the bravest sort. It was unlikely anything would happen to Lily, even if Carrie told her superiors what had happened. In fact, she planned to keep her head down and her mouth shut as usual. Her room was at the very end of the hall. As she drew close to her door, the third plank of wood in the floor creaked and groaned. It did this every time anyone walked over it. She considered it her own warning system to notify her when someone was coming. Once inside her room, she clasped the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. It wasn't like her to be fanciful, of course, but the open fields of Nebraska sounded pretty good to her. Carrie sat on the edge of her bed and opened the envelope. A picture slid out and dropped onto her bed. That had to be him. Clarence Harris. She took her time looking at him. His face was serious, and his body was wiry. He had pale hair and eyes, but his skin had the look of many hours in the sun. It was hard to make out his hands, but she didn't think he had manicured nails. Most of the men she'd been around had perfect nails, and they wouldn't know physical labor if it jumped up and bit them. His rough hands were a good sign, as far as she was concerned. He was a handsome man, all told. Of course, Carrie didn't weigh this in her considerations, but it didn't hurt. The letter read as follows. Dear Carrie, I hope this letter finds you well. I shared your information with Clarence, and he has agreed to bring you out to Nebraska as soon as possible. I encouraged him to write to you first, but he had no interest. It's best if both parties get to know one another a while before making such a big decision, but I've learned enough about the two of you to know this will be a successful contract. Please make your arrangements and see the clerk at our local office about your passage straight away. Funds have been wired and a telegram sent. Sincerely, Margaret. Carrie sighed with relief. This was what she wanted. A chance to make a life for herself, and a chance to work alongside a husband who was a partner to her. She was pleased that Clarence liked her enough to send for her, and that things were moving so quickly. Surely, the housekeeper would release her right away. After all, the streets were filled with young women desperate for a job such as hers. Besides, after tonight's fiasco, it might be for the best anyway. She had just an hour to herself before the guests would be ready to move on from dinner. At that point, she'd have more cleaning to do. Only then could she have a bite to eat from the kitchen before turning in for the night. In the meantime, she wanted to safeguard her precious moments of freedom. Just as she began to put the letter away, she heard the floorboard creak. Could it be that Lily was on her way to apologize? That would be out of character, but perhaps she felt bad for a change. Carrie stood and headed over to her door. Just as she reached for the handle, it began to turn slowly. She jumped back and gasped. That was certainly not like Lily. Best to find out who it was. Who's there? She asked. The door swung open without a sound. Her blue eyes opened wide with wonder. There, standing before her, was Edward, the senator's son. Good evening, he said in a low voice. I trust I'm not interrupting anything? The others are occupied at the moment. No. Why are you here? Surely the guests downstairs are more appealing to you? No. You are quite appealing, Carrie. You're a lovely, innocent flower. I've come to breathe in your fragrance for a time. Breathe in my... How exactly may I help you, sir? The name is Edward. Remember? She didn't dare call him by his Christian name. Sir, if I'm found alone with you, people will talk. I will be in trouble. It isn't proper. What do you want with me? Oh, you have spirit, too. I like that. I've come to collect my fee. I put in a good word for you, and now you can do something for me. How's that sound? Are you suggesting? She began to inch around him, closer to the door. This would get ugly, she could tell. She'd heard tales of wealthy men taking advantage of poor girls. None of them had happy endings. This was turning into a living nightmare. He reached for her waist, but she outmaneuvered him and made a break for the door. Keeping her wits about her, she didn't stop running until she'd caught up with the head housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson. Carrie was so out of breath that it took her a full minute to tell the old woman what had happened. Mrs. Henderson clucked her tongue. Young men from privileged families do what they will. I suppose he didn't hurt you, then? No, ma'am. Just frightened me. If I'd stayed. But you didn't. It's over now. Best get to work, since you're here. That was it. Nothing else was said. Carrie kept out of sight until Edward and his family were gone. It aggravated her that he could get away with such a thing. What was to keep him from trying again? No, it was best she left for good. The sooner the better. When they had finished their work for the night, she pulled Mrs. Henderson aside. The woman frowned at her. I'm glad you found me. I was about to look for you. The butler wanted to speak to you before you turned in. Apparently, you made a fool of yourself earlier tonight, yes? I fell down some stairs. I see. Very clumsy of you. Let's go find him. They hadn't walked more than a few steps before they came across the butler, who was carrying supplies to another room. His tall, lanky frame made him an imposing figure in Carrie's mind. Perhaps it was her first encounter with him at the mansion, or perhaps it was his acerbic expression. Whatever it was, she always did her best to avoid the man. There you are. Been scurrying about tonight, I see. Mrs. Henderson, this young woman is to be let go. She embarrassed our employers tonight by her buffoonery. She tells me she fell down the stairs. She didn't say it was in front of guests, said Mrs. Henderson. The two of them turned a critical eye on Carrie. It wasn't in Carrie's nature to show fear, and she didn't do so now. She met their gaze. Since there was nothing to lose, she took a gamble on telling the truth. Lily pushed me, ma'am. Then I lost my footing and fell. I'm surprised they decided to fire me. It wasn't my fault, and that's the truth of it. The butler cleared his throat. There's the matter of the young man. At first, he came to your defense, as a young gentleman would. Later, however, he informed me of your rudeness. That is the last straw. You are to pack your things in the morning and leave. I have something to say about that, said Carrie, becoming bolder now. I've no interest in what you have to say, said the butler. I'm sure it would just be more lies. To think you'd blame your clumsiness on poor Lily. She's a lovely girl and an excellent maid. You do well to follow her example. For your information, I was actually looking for you earlier tonight. The butler arched an eyebrow. Mrs. Henderson held her breath and closed her eyes. I came to tender my resignation. I have a new situation. I'm afraid it will be difficult to keep a new situation with a black mark on your record, he said. I'm going out west. I have a husband waiting for me. He wants me and finds me valuable. He sees more in me than anyone ever will in this house. So, you may take your black mark and sit squarely upon it. It was the first and last outburst Carrie had ever made in that house. It was so out of character for her, that the butler and Mrs. Henderson stood there in shock a full minute after she'd left. By the time Carrie reached her room, the adrenaline of the moment had passed, but she felt no shame in what she'd said. A person can take only so much, she decided. When nothing mattered anymore, why not say what was on her mind? That night, she had the best sleep of her life. When the morning sunlight touched her eyes, Carrie awoke. This was the latest she'd ever slept. No one had bothered her. No one had knocked on her door. A sense of freedom and joy washed over her as she packed her few belongings and closed the door of her room behind her forever. As she stepped down the servants' stairs, she scarcely noticed anyone. Word had spread quickly, and the two other young maids looked at her with newly opened eyes. This quiet scullery maid who never fought back, had made a stand and was leaving for better things. All this time, she'd kept it to herself. There was more to Carrie than either of them knew. Just as Carrie reached for the door to leave for good, Lily stopped her. "Is it true? You're getting married? You're going west?" Carrie looked her nemesis in the eye and said, "Yes, I am. I'll never see any of you ever again, and that makes me very happy." With that, Carrie walked out the door and closed it sharply. She didn't stay to see the impact her words had. It didn't really matter to her. All that mattered was finding the clerk Margaret had mentioned in her letter. Carrie had only been to the Heavenly Doves matchmaking service once. It's not like she made it across the city very often, and when she did, it nearly always was on an errand for the house. But today, Carrie was on her own. She needed a carriage ride to make the trip go faster, but that was a luxury she couldn't afford. Instead, as usual, she set off on foot. The fact that she had been active and healthy most of her life meant she had great stamina and speed, so a mere hour later, she arrived at the office. It didn't take long to get her package. When she opened it, there was an astonishing amount of money inside. Of course, she had to spend most of it on her train ticket, but there was enough left for her to eat well along the way. Just holding that much money made her uncomfortable, and she was thankful to be rid of most of it once she paid the ticket master at the station. Carrie's trip to Nebraska went quickly and without much excitement. Other than the fact that she'd never been on a train before, she saw the experience as merely a means to an end. For most of the journey, she slept or watched the unfamiliar countryside go by. It was midday on a Saturday when she arrived in Landy City. She took a deep breath, grabbed hold of her bag, and stepped out of the train and onto the platform. The air smelled different there. It smelled of wet earth, horses, and something she couldn't quite make out. The fairly modern-looking station gave her some hope. This town may be more civilized than she had assumed. She quickly made her way into the city proper. Chapter 4. Clarence had no idea why, but for some reason, his stomach was in knots as he rode his horse into town. He'd been to Landy City countless times, so that couldn't be it. Of course, he was meeting his bride-to-be, but he kept telling himself that this was just another business transaction. Maybe it was heartburn. As he approached the outskirts of town, he stopped by Lawrence's general store. Clarence had been a good customer of his for a long time, even before Lawrence had married his wife, Margaret, the matchmaking lady. The man's prices were fair, and he was an upstanding member of the community. Perhaps, Lawrence could sell him a little soda bicarbonate. It never occurred to Clarence to stop by a chemist's shop. As far as he was concerned, the whole lot were snake oil salesmen. When he entered the shop, he saw one of Lawrence's workers, Harold. Harold was having a serious chat with his young nephew, young Will. From what Clarence could surmise, Will had just spilled a fair amount of flour on the floor, and Harold was quite upset about it. "Ah, I was gonna bake you a cake," Will blubbered. His bottom lip quivered as he spoke. Harold dried the tears from the boy's flour-covered face and gave him a grudging smile. "Will, if you want to learn how to bake things, I'll show you when we get home, how's that? But you must promise me to stay out of things like this while I'm at work. I will need to pay for everything you've spilled. Understand?" The boy put his arms out, and Harold gave him a hug. The boy sniveled for only a few moments, and then he pulled away, a determined look on his face. "I'll help clean up, all right," he said in all earnestness. "Sounds good. I'll get the broom. Just let me tend to the flour that landed above the floorboards. Deal?" Soon, Will was busy pulling the broom across the floor with not quite enough skill to gather up all the flour. That didn't stop him from trying, however. Clarence cleared his throat. "Is Lawrence around?" he asked Harold. "I'm right here," Lawrence said, emerging from the storage room at the back of the store. "Got any sodium bicarbonate handy?" "Hello there, Clarence. As a matter of fact, I do. You don't look so good. You okay?" What brings you into town? A lot of questions there. Yeah, I'm okay. Just indigestion. Came to town on business. Aren't you here to meet your bride? Asked Harold. Nosy, ain't ya? Yeah, I am. Here's your money, Lawrence. I'll be off. Good day to you both. As he left the store, Clarence thought he heard the sound of laughter. He shrugged it off and continued down the road. Once he reached the hotel where Carrie was staying, he figured he could get some water at the dining room and take his powder there. Chapter 5. Carrie had no difficulty navigating her way around Landy City, and it didn't take her long to find the hotel. She wasn't expecting much, but when she arrived to see the cobweb-covered, crumbling brick exterior, something didn't set well with her. Once inside, she saw that the furnishings left something to be desired, and it was like stepping back into her life as a scullery maid with a lot of cleaning to be done. Rather than get emotional about it, however, she summoned up her strength and decided to make the best of it. Who knew what her fiancé would be like? Perhaps his home would be better than this. The two had nothing to do with one another. She settled into her room, unpacked her few things, and set about getting the wrinkles out of her clothes. There was no use borrowing trouble, she decided. It was a silly thing to do. This was a new land, with new people, and a new life for her. Already, people had been friendlier to her out here than they ever were back home. Home. She thought about that. This was her home now. The Landy Hotel loomed before him like an overgrown tombstone. Sure, it wasn't the fanciest hotel in town, but he wasn't going to pay for frills. All his future bride needed was a clean bed to sleep in and a roof over her head. At the thought of his bride, his indigestion grew worse. The sooner he took his powder, the better. When he walked inside, he noticed that the place was clean, but it was in a state of disrepair. He may be practical, but there was a limit, as far as he was concerned. It really bothered him the more he thought about it. Surely, he could have provided better. Then, he saw her. Carrie was the most beautiful woman he'd ever laid eyes on, so much so, that it was difficult for him to process. Before he let his emotions get the best of him, he decided to take control. It was a silly thing to do, gaping over a woman like that. Most unseemly. He straightened his hair, just in case, stood up taller, and walked over to meet her. Hello, name's Clarence. You're Carrie, right? She looked him in the eye and extended her hand for a firm handshake. Good to meet you. Thank you for the quick passage here. Your room all right? It's fine. Been in town long? Just got here an hour ago or so. Well, I need some water. Haven't had supper yet. Neither have I. He began to shuffle his feet and fiddle with his hat. What on earth was happening to him? It was time to be a grown man and ask her to supper. It would be expensive, he didn't like that, but there wasn't much he could do about it. Would you like to have supper with me? I haven't eaten yet. You said that. So, I did. Follow me. He tried his best to walk casually to the dining room of the hotel and bid her follow. Carrie appeared to be used to walking behind others, but it surprised him that in no time, she made her way to his side. This made him even more nervous. She smelled like a lady, and he wasn't accustomed to that. When they arrived, she stopped by her chair and waited. He looked at her for a moment, puzzled. The hostess cleared her throat and caught his eye. She tilted her head over to Carrie. Then and only then did it dawn on him to help her to her seat. Oh. Not used to, It's all right. Never had a gentleman do this for me before. Just wondered if you would, Carrie said as she sat down. The waitress asked for their order. Lawrence ordered the daily special, figuring he might save a few cents. Miss Margaret said you'd probably dine here. You been working with her, right? Ain't you one of them brides Margaret arranged through the mail-order bride service she works for? The girl asked. Lawd, but we miss Margaret's husband coming around. He was a regular, you know. But now he's married, and his wife keeps him so well fed, there ain't no reason for him to dine here." Carrie smiled at the bubbly girl. Then with a swirl, the girl left to fetch their order. As they tucked into their meal, Clarence dove in with his usual gusto. He only paused when he saw the look of surprise on Carrie's face as she ate with impeccable table manners. Sheepishly, he put down his knife and fork, remembered his sodium bicarbonate, and guzzled it down quickly in his water. "How long have you been a farmer?" she asked. "All my life." "Ah. Bought my property when I was but 23 years of age. It's mine now, fair and square. House, too. That's wonderful. Have you always been in Nebraska?" "Yup." "Ah." The rest of the meal passed in relative silence. Clarence began to worry. Would she always pester him with questions like this? When it was time to part, he remembered to pull out her chair. Then came the words he'd rehearsed. "Carrie, I'd like us to get hitched as soon as possible, so I can give notice to my cook. What say you and me make arrangements with the minister at church tomorrow?" Carrie blinked. "I suppose so. Yes, that would be fine. Good night, Clarence. I'll see you again tomorrow." Chapter 6. Once she got back to her room, Carrie sat at the little table beside her window. For quite some time, she just sat and looked out at the people walking by. She really didn't know what to think. After all, this was what she had signed up for. She had asked no questions of Margaret, and she'd said she wasn't picky, right? Yet, Clarence wasn't what she'd expected. Still, there was something about this clumsy, awkward farmer she liked. He had an honest face, well-worn hands, and an earthy smell about him that she found strangely homey. It was all she could do not to laugh just a little when his face turned a bright shade of pink. Apparently, the idea of being a gentleman was as alien to him as being a lady was to her. She wouldn't do that to him again. There was no need. They were farmers, not fancy city folk. And that was enough reflection on the day's events for Carrie. She wasn't one to overanalyze things. It was time to go for a walk and survey the town. Finding the general stores with the best prices and products would show her usefulness and thrift to Clarence. She was well versed in the art of deal-making back in Washington. Surely, it worked the same way out there in Landy City. It only took Carrie one stop to find out that it was not, in fact, the same out there. Evidently, questioning prices and dickering for the lowest cost wasn't done in Landy City. She was clearly an outsider, and it didn't go well. Making a hasty retreat after fearing she'd offended someone, she moved down the street with a new awareness of her environment. With her lesson learned, she visited the next store, which was owned by Lawrence Roberts. Lawrence greeted her with a smile. "Good day, miss. Don't think I've seen you around before, have I?" No. My name is Carrie. I'm here to marry Clarence Harris. Have you heard of him?" A look of understanding passed over his face. "Of course, I have. Welcome to you. Clarence already has an account here. Did you know that? You're welcome to look about and ask any questions. Don't mind little Will over there. He's kind of our junior helper, really." Will was hard at work, making his wooden horse jump an imaginary fence. At the mention of his name, he looked over and smiled a greeting. "Hi," he said. "You're a pretty lady." "Why, thank you," she said. "That's a nice horse you have there." "Yeah, Uncle Harold made him for me. He's learning to jump." He let loose his best whinnying sound. Once Carrie found out about Clarence's account, she decided this must be the best place to shop, so she set about looking over the food items, most of which met her approval. She spent some time chatting with Lawrence, and he introduced her to some of the customers in the store. Lawrence must have known about people well enough to know that introductions made an outsider feel more at ease. When Carrie headed for the door, he said, "Will you be joining us for church tomorrow?" "Clarence attends the same church I do, so I'll be seeing you there." "Oh, and my wife's Margaret. Margaret Roberts. You likely know her through Heavenly Doves. We attend the church right next to the telegraph office." Carrie grinned. No wonder, he seemed to welcoming and understanding of her new status in town. Oh, I see. Yes, I do know her. She's my agent. Yes, I'll be there, and it'll be nice to see a familiar face. Thanks, Lawrence. I'm sure I'll be seeing you on a regular basis when I come to town in the future. As Clarence rode his way back home, the afternoon's events kept passing through his mind. Carrie was a beautiful woman, but would this work out? Would she be a good worker, a good helper? Would he ever get rid of this indigestion? It seemed the farther he rode from town, the better he felt, though. Maybe it had something to do with her. He gave his horse a nudge and headed down the dirt road at a faster pace. The fields weren't going to maintain themselves, and the farmhands were probably taking this as a day off. The thought of what needed done quickly replaced his apprehension, and by the time he arrived home, he felt much better. Early the next morning, Carrie was ready to go to church. After a simple breakfast, she bounded down the stairs, through the lobby, and out the door. Of course, she was a little nervous. After all, the only people in town she'd spent any time with at all were Clarence and Lawrence. Even then, she didn't know them very well. Still, church was a safe space to her. She had saved up her money for a Sunday dress, and now she was finally able to wear it. It wasn't her usual dark gray. It was blue, and it flattered her trim figure. Her hair was still pulled into a severe bun, but that didn't hide her lovely face. The color of the dress brought out her violet eyes. As she made her way up the steps to the church, she looked about for Clarence. At first, she didn't see him. Not one to panic about such things, she decided to step aside in the back and wait while others filed in. Lawrence greeted her. Morning, Carrie. Good to see you made it. Haven't seen Clarence yet. I'm sure he'll be here. Would you like me to escort you to a seat? I'll wait here for him, but thank you, she said. Clarence was doing his best, but he was running late. He never ran late. For some reason, that morning he couldn't find his right sock to save his life. By the time he made it out the door, he had to ride a bit faster than usual. The thing was, he didn't want to put too much stress on his horse. King, his unremarkable horse, was getting on in years, but the boy still had some use left in him. In his mind, Clarence reasoned that if he didn't push King too hard, then he would hold on longer. He had one other horse, Queen, but she was even older. Clarence picked up the pace a bit, but not enough to make up for the time he'd lost. By the time he arrived at church, the bell in the tower was ringing, signaling the start to services. This was not good. What a negative impression to give. He hitched up King and hurried to the door. There, just inside, was Carrie. He had a fleeting thought that she looked even more beautiful than yesterday, but his immediate goal was to find a seat with her. He dabbed his forehead with his handkerchief and stood by her side. She gave him a faint smile. He tilted his head toward the first available pew. It wasn't his usual seat, but it was there, and he wanted to avoid as much embarrassment as possible. Just as they sat, the minister said, "All rise and sing the opening hymn." There was nothing to do but stand back up, pick up a hymnal, and sing. The little organ began to play, and the congregation started in. When Clarence heard Carrie's lovely alto voice, he didn't hold back on his deep baritone. The rest of the service went by without much difficulty. They sat at a distance from each other, not touching. Neither of them looked at each other, either, preferring to focus on the goings-on up front. When the final hymn had concluded, Clarence turned to her at last and told her it was time to speak with the minister. They waited at the back of the line. It was customary to greet the minister before going on to the social hour. Clarence was never a fan of the social hour. He only went because he felt it was sensible to keep relationships with neighbors civil. Carrie didn't know what to expect. When at last it was their turn, Clarence took the minister aside. "Reverend Fowler, I'd like you to meet Carrie. She is to be my wife, and I'd like you to marry us as soon as possible." The minister raised an eyebrow. Carrie said, "Hello, Reverend. Please, just call me Fowler. I'm not so formal, but I have a whale of a time convincing Clarence, here. It's good to meet you, Carrie. What's this about you two being betrothed? This is the first I've heard of it. Well, you see, I'm a mail order. Pay no attention, Reverend. She's a lovely young lady I met through an acquaintance. Sounds like she was going to say, mail order bride, Clarence. There's no shame in admitting the truth. You are indeed a lovely young lady, miss. If your mind is made up, who am I to stand in your way? When could you do it, Reverend? Asked a red-faced Clarence. Is there a specific reason you need to rush into this? Have you been honorable, Clarence? Me? What? Oh. Of course, Reverend. We just met in person yesterday. This is merely for practicality's sake, you see. And is this your wish, too, Carrie? It is, Fowler, thank you for asking. Very well, what about tomorrow? Clarence nodded and shook the minister's hand. Then, he turned to shake Carrie's hand. The minister said nothing, but looked a bit surprised at Clarence's actions. Carrie merely shrugged and accepted her fiancé's handshake. It was settled. As of tomorrow, she would be a married woman. Chapter 7. The wedding day arrived. Carrie sat in the church hall with only Margaret to keep her company. It felt strange, alien, to be getting ready for her wedding day and have little to no emotional rush about it. Clarence was an attractive man. His hair had been bleached a pale shade of blonde by the sun, and his face was finely sculpted. He seemed kind to her, and she supposed he always would be. She just wondered whether he held any affection for her at all, and if not, would it ever grow between them? It wasn't that she was overly sentimental, it was just that she didn't realize what life would be like out in the country. There weren't nearly as many people to talk to, and the understanding was dawning on her that she would spend great stretches of time alone. Or with only Clarence. Carrie didn't speak of these concerns, however. There was no point. This was the life she chose. This was her big day, and Margaret was there to help her get ready, not to listen to the bride carry on about her cold feet. Carrie was dressed in her Sunday dress. It looked nice on her, and it was her intention to wear her hair in the same severe way. Margaret evidently knew how to be diplomatic when she needed to be, and she employed her skills right then. You know, dear, I think you should shock Clarence. Give him something to remember. Would you like that? I suppose. What do you have in mind? Well, I wanted to surprise you, too, so I brought some ribbons. I assume you aren't a fan of bright colors, so I chose the same color blue as your dress, and black, of course. Which do you prefer? I don't understand. Well, you only get married once, right? God willing. Well, yes, God willing. What I mean is, you want to look as pretty as possible, right? I suppose. You have a lovely face, dear, and the most beautiful violet eyes I've ever seen. Until I met you, I didn't know eyes could be that color. I imagine your hair is beautiful too, but, well, would you mind if I did your hair today? Make it special and put ribbons in it? I think you'd be surprised, and I know Clarence will be so taken with you that he'll want to start the honeymoon right away. She chuckled lightly. I don't know. I guess I'm willing to try, said Carrie. After half an hour of brushing Carrie's hair, arranging it, and adding the ribbons, Margaret couldn't stop smiling. You have the loveliest auburn hair, Carrie. I had no idea it was that color. Are your curls natural? Or do you tie them with rags when you sleep? The curls are natural. I've never had to use rags. May I see my hair? Margaret held up a looking glass, and Carrie gasped. There, in the mirror, she saw a gorgeous young woman, the height of fashion. She had no idea this was possible. There was a knock at the door. Lawrence called out Carrie's name. Margaret stood back and regarded her. You ready? Oh, goodness, Carrie. You are a breathtaking sight. And from the knock on the door, I'd say Clarence is ready for you. Clarence stood beside the minister and fidgeted with his Sunday clothes. His collar felt too tight, his shirt was too itchy, and his indigestion had been intolerable ever since he arrived. Was this how all grooms felt? If so, he had no idea why weddings were such a great idea, other than to make the marriage official in the eyes of the law and before God. It made sense, of course, but that didn't help his jitters at that moment. The wedding should have started exactly 1 minute ago. He knew that because he'd been asking Lawrence for the time every 3 minutes. Finally, Lawrence took pity on him and left to check on the ladies. There weren't that many people in attendance. Clarence hadn't given anybody any warning after all, and no one knew the bride. There were a few ladies who came simply out of curiosity, and one old widow came because she simply loved to watch weddings. At long last, Lawrence returned with an announcement that the bride was ready at last. Clarence gulped. The organist hit the keys, and he actually jumped, high enough for the spectators to chuckle. The tittering continued until Carrie entered the church, and then all fell silent, save the organ. Clarence couldn't believe his eyes. There was his bride, more beautiful than he'd ever imagined, and that was saying something. His heart threatened to force its way into his throat, it beat so hard. He swallowed with difficulty and managed to smile, lest she think he wasn't happy. Carrie looked about the church in wonder. It didn't surprise her to see the lack of well-wishers, but the looks on the faces of those in attendance as she walked toward the altar puzzled her. Nevertheless, she decided to focus her attention on her future husband. At first, he was dreadfully pale, even through his tanned skin, so much so that she feared he would pass out. Then, he seemed to snap out of it and gave her the biggest smile she'd seen from him yet. That gave her the courage she needed to proceed with confidence. Margaret had been right to fuss with her hair. Clarence clearly liked what he saw, and Carrie felt good about herself. When the service was over, they didn't have a reception. Neither of them was much of a socializer, and there had been no time to plan one anyway. Clarence had taken the rare luxury of bringing his wagon that day, and he and his bride rode all the way home at a leisurely pace. Chapter 8. The first week went well, considering. Both bride and groom had to figure out how things were going to work, and how they were going to get along. Clarence made it clear that Carrie was expected to take over the kitchen and household duties. That might not have been much, but she would have 4 very hungry, messy men to feed and clean up after. Clarence thought he'd be generous and had given himself and his bride their wedding day off. He had cold cuts and bread the former cook had made available for a special late dinner, and he had enough food to fix the following day, or at least he assumed so. All he expected was the same hot, monotonous food he'd always had. The cheaper it was, the better, of course. The first afternoon went quite well. He showed Carrie around the house and the areas outside that would be under her domain, such as the henhouse and a garden space. The garden had already been planted, for the most part, but it hadn't been tended very well. Clarence hoped Carrie would take this plot of land seriously, as it could feed them for most of the winter, in a pinch. Taking care of chickens and the garden seemed like common sense to him, so he didn't bother with much instruction. She could learn as she did. He'd send one of the boys to check on her, if need be. That day, when the sun's rays dipped below the horizon, thoughts turned to bedtime and their wedding night. Thinking of it made Clarence sweat. He'd never done as much as kiss a girl, let alone a full-grown woman. Hopefully, Carrie was just as innocent as he was. Still, this would be one of the hardest things he'd ever done. He'd have to buck up and be a good husband, especially if he wanted those strapping sons he'd told Margaret Robinson he wanted. Carrie? Yes? I suppose there's no putting this off. It's time for bed. It appears so. I mean, you and I, that is. Oh. Oh, that. Oh dear, I see. I suppose so. He saw her cheeks redden. Well, let's be proper. I should kiss you first, don't you think? That makes sense. Clarence awkwardly put his arms about his bride. She was warm, lithe, and smelled of roses. This made him even more tense. He did his best to give her his first kiss. It was amateurish, but she was warm and accommodating. This gave him more confidence, and he tried again. It went better the second time, and he found himself not minding so much. She really was a lovely woman. "Time for bed, my dear," he said roughly. The next morning, Carrie opened her eyes. She was a married woman now. There were no two ways about it. She turned her head to look at her husband, who was still sound asleep. The sun had not yet risen, and the rooster hadn't crowed, but she felt no need to stay in bed, even though it had been quite late by the time they fell asleep. Quietly and carefully, she changed into her work dress and set about cleaning the kitchen. She hadn't said anything to Clarence, but its state of cleanliness left something to be desired. She wasn't sure if it had always been this way, or if the cook simply gave up before leaving. Carrie noticed the rest of the house was kept up reasonably well, although she could do much better. Years of experience told her that. Carrie started with the pots and pans. They had been rinsed, but there were stains and crusts of older meals still there. When she was satisfied, she decided the kitchen was organized all wrong. This wouldn't do, it just wasn't very efficient. It took some time to do this, and she had to plan it out. She was midway through the transformation, and the kitchen looked like a disaster, when Clarence wandered in, his eyes half closed. When he saw the disarray, his eyes suddenly focused. "What in tarnation are you doing?" "Rearranging the kitchen. It wasn't planned out very well, and I did it myself." "Tell me, what did you find not very well?" Carrie stood her ground. "Well, you had your pots and pans clear across the kitchen from the stove. They are heavy for me, and I wanted room for." "Oh, for heaven's sake, just leave things as they are." "Are we married?" "Of course, we are." "Is this my house, too? Am I responsible for its upkeep? Am I responsible for meal preparation and cleanup?" "Yes, but..." "Fine then. I need the pots and pans closer to the stove and sink, so I don't have to carry them as far. Doesn't that make sense?" Clarence was more than a little uncomfortable. No one had challenged him before, and it pained him to admit it, but Carrie had a point. The cook had often complained of backaches. Perhaps this was why. Besides, it was indeed Carrie's house, too. Instead of giving into his bluster to cover insecurity, he took control of his emotions. "All right, Carrie. You do as you see fit. I'll wait until you've finished before I comment. Until then, would you mind taking a moment to gather a few eggs and fix them for breakfast? We have bacon, too." Carrie had been defensive, but now she felt much better. It was good to know her husband could be reasoned with. That gave her hope. She picked up a large skillet, placed it on the stove, grabbed the egg basket, and headed out the door to face the henhouse. This was something she'd never done before, but she was determined to show her usefulness, so she marched over, opened the gate, and continued to the little house. Unfortunately, she didn't think to close the gate behind her, and while she was inside, trying not to get pecked while gathering the eggs, some chicks wandered out into the yard. By the time she came back out, some of them had made quite a head start. When she realized what had happened, she set down the basket, gathered those tiny babes closest, and took off after the naughtiest ones, remembering to close the gate this time. When she got back inside, she acted as though nothing had happened. Clarence, who jerked back from the window looking suspiciously as if he'd watched the entire thing, said nothing. But his face was covered with a goofy smile as he ate his eggs. They may have had a few scuffles here and there, such as whether Carrie should continue serving the same food as the last cook, or whether they should eat like a herd of pigs, but for the most part, Carrie got her way. Clarence hated to admit it, but he was changing. Pinching every penny was not necessarily the most important thing in life to him anymore. His wife had made her impact throughout the house. The kitchen was orderly, the house was cleaner than it had ever been, and the garden was flourishing. Even the chickens seemed happy. It really had been a good decision on his part to marry this woman, he decided. She was the best thing to ever happen to him, and it helped him get out of bed with more enthusiasm every morning. Carrie was happy in many respects. Clarence was the hardest worker she'd ever seen. Other than the day after their wedding, he awoke earlier than she did, worked all day and into the night, even after he let the farmhands go, and he never spoke an unkind word to her even when they had disagreements. Technically, it was all she could have asked for, but the romance department left something to be desired. She couldn't understand why he was so reluctant to kiss her much. After all, she thought they were getting better at it. It would also be wonderful if he'd break down and hold her hand from time to time, but he never did. She settled for the support of a good, hard-working man, which of course, she knew was no small thing. Chapter 9. The days turned into weeks, and things continued in this manner. Then, one day, everything the new couple knew and loved fell into jeopardy. It was a day like any other. Clarence was in the fields with his workers, and Carrie was inside with 3 neighbor children, a boy and 2 girls. Daniel, the boy, was just 4 years old, Helen was 6, and the littlest, Susan, was just 3. Daniel didn't like taking orders from his older sister and made no bones about it. Susan just toddled about, being adorable. They were a handful, but Carrie was doing her best to help out her neighbor by watching them for a while. She didn't realize how noisy 3 children could be, but it didn't put her off one bit. It was a nice change of pace, really. They helped her with the chickens and with weeding the garden, although Carrie spent much of that time holding Susan on her hip so the youngster wouldn't fuss. Clarence paused now and again to watch his wife interact with the children as he tended his fields. He was very happy, in part because the yield would be good this year, and in part because he saw how good Carrie was with children. He heard them laughing, but he also noticed that she was teaching them to work. This was an important lesson in his mind. Yes, he had married the right woman, no doubt about it. Clarence's farmhands had noticed a change in him. They'd never say so to his face, but he overheard them talking about how he had a new sense of humor. That was a shock. And he heard them say that he was far nicer than before. They agreed that it was a pain to eat, politely, at Carrie's insistence, but at least the food was considerably better. In turn, they were more productive. Clarence hadn't said anything to them, but he decided that if the yield was as good as he thought it would be, he would give the boys a bonus. He wouldn't go crazy, of course, as it was something he'd never done before. As they worked the land that day, something hit Tom's hat and tumbled to the ground. At first, the farmhand thought one of his co-workers was playing a prank. "Hey, Harry. Knock it off," he growled. "What?" "You know what. It couldn't have been Robert. First of all, his aim is awful, and second, he's too far away." "Ain't got a clue what you're on about," said Harry. Then something hit Harry on the top of the head. "Hey, Tom. You throwin' something at me? What gives?" "No, course I didn't." "What?" 3 more things fell from the sky and landed at their feet. By the time they realized what it was, Clarence, who'd been watching the whole scene, began shouting. "Locusts. We're in for locusts, boys. Gather around." Carrie had just put Susan down for a nap when the sun was partially obscured by a dark cloud. And not a normal cloud, either. It seemed to pulse and fluctuate. What on earth could it be? It wasn't like her to panic about things before knowing the facts, so she set the other 2 children to a little task and walked over to the nearest window that overlooked the fields. The thick black cloud hovered. And hummed. Since when did a cloud hum? She furrowed her brow and tried to guess what it could be. A sudden thunderhead? It just didn't make sense. She saw her husband run across the field, shouting. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The last thing she needed to do was panic. She had 3 small children to watch over. Carrie looked over her shoulder at the children. Surely, they would be all right for just a moment while she ran into the field to find out what was going on. She put on a smile and did her best to pretend nothing was wrong. "Children, I need to speak with Clarence for a moment. Helen, will you make sure no one gets into trouble? There's a good big sister." "Course I can." "Daniel, don't you move from there," bossed the little girl. Daniel was not happy and began to pout. Carrie stifled a laugh and patted the boy's shoulder. "It's okay, Daniel. I won't be gone long." She walked at a normal pace to the door, opened and closed it gently, and then ran as fast she could once outside. The men and boys were discussing something, and their faces were quite grave. Her attention was diverted by what seemed like a dust tornado on the horizon. What on earth was it? Clarence felt the edge of panic as he outlined his plans. They would dig trenches in places around the fields and set them alight. God willing, the smoke would drive out the voracious insects. They would coat wood with tar and set it on fire. The wood would hopefully burn long enough to stave off the stubborn locusts. He hoped and prayed his farm would be spared. Carrie ran toward them. So far, she had been a wonderful helper. He only hoped she would be one now. He turned to see what had stopped her in her tracks. It was an organized swarm, so big, it looked like a huge swirl of dust. He swallowed hard. "What is it, Clarence? What's happening?" Carrie asked in a rising voice. "A locust swarm. A big one. They swarm like tornadoes. They can devastate one place, and leave the next alone. We can't bank on anything, though. They're already falling from the sky. I need you to protect yourself, the children, and the chickens, in that order." Carrie looked at him, stunned. "What do you mean, protect myself? They're insects. If there were just a few, there'd be no need. Carrie, that swarm contains millions. They eat everything, and I mean everything. Corn, wheat, wood handles, fence posts, leather gloves, saddles. They've been known to strip the paint off barn doors." Carrie looked at him with wide eyes. "Chickens, especially juvenile chicks, are no match. Can you handle this?" Her eyes grew wider yet. "Yes. Yes. Of course." And she tore off back across the field. Chapter 10. When Carrie returned to the yard, her mind whirled. She figured the children were safe inside. The chickens, what to do for them? She hustled every last one of them, even the rooster, into the henhouse and slammed the door. She flinched as a sizable sliver lodged into her finger, drawing blood. She pinched at it, finally getting it out, her eyes smarting with tears. She had no time to worry about it. On her way to the house, she realized with horror that the garden she had tended with such care would never survive such an onslaught. First things first, she decided. She'd check on the children and tell them to prepare without frightening them. When she closed the door of the house behind her, she heard the sound of a child wailing. "Not now, dear Lord, not now." Carrie surveyed the scene. It was Daniel, who was bent double and howling. Unbelievably, Sarah was still asleep, although she was stirring. "Daniel," she said in a stern tone, "now's not the time. Dry your tears. I need you to be a big, strong boy right now. It's very important." He looked up at her with watery eyes and a runny nose. Helen, who had been sitting across from him, arms folded, looked guilty of something. "Children, I don't have time to hear who did what to whom," said Carrie. "Do you know what locusts are?" Helen clasped her hand over her mouth in fear. She was old enough to know, and perhaps she remembered previous swarms. Before she had a chance to spread her panic, Carrie walked over to her and put both hands on her shoulders. "There's nothing to be afraid of. Locusts are nothing more than insects. The only thing that makes this uncomfortable is the number of them. We will have to deal with quite a few, so I need you to be brave and calm. Do you understand?" Helen nodded her head and began rubbing her eyes. Daniel, who hadn't quite gotten over his crying spell, stared at his big sister. Clearly, he could tell something wasn't right. Carrie walked around until she faced both children and crouched down to their level. "I promise, nothing will hurt you. At worst, it will just be unpleasant, do you understand? It won't last forever, I promise." She caressed Helen's cheek with her hand and smiled reassuringly at the girl. This seemed to do the trick. Helen wrapped her arms around Carrie, and Daniel joined suit. It didn't last long, however. The sound of hail began to thunder down on the rooftop. The locusts had arrived in earnest. "I must go outside and try to cover the garden. I need to protect it. Helen, Daniel, I need both of you as helpers." Would you gently awaken Sarah? Don't frighten her. See if you can make this a game, if you can. I want you to crawl into my bed and snuggle beneath my covers, understand? Wait for me. I won't be long. The two children nodded their heads. Carrie threw an extra blanket over her head and dashed outside. Immediately, she was pelted by an onslaught of locusts. They rained over her, and she did her best to concentrate and fight her way through. This task was simply too important. But what to do? How could she protect the plants from all these hungry mouths? She closed her eyes and ran blindly to the barn. The horses were in a panic. She secured them in their stalls, as the roar from outside grew louder and more insistent. Desperately, she looked about for something to cover her crops. Her eyes fell upon a stack of feed sacks. Knowing they wouldn't be enough, she nevertheless grabbed them up and raced outside, closing the barn doors and bolting them shut behind her. Choking smoke poured from the fields and still, the locusts came. Clarence and his farmhands battled with their flaming chunks of wood, but it seemed to have little effect. The air grew thicker and thicker with bugs and smoke, and there was no relief in sight. All of them had pulled handkerchiefs around mouths and noses to filter some of the smoke, but it didn't help much. It was not going well. Dear Lord in heaven, it was not going well. Clarence did his best to focus on the task at hand and not give in to his rising feeling of alarm. He ran to another section closer to the house and saw his wife emerge from the barn with a large stack of feed sacks in hand. What was she doing? Clarence had already seen her take care of the chickens, and there was no sign of trouble coming from the house. She should be inside with the children. Then, the real attack began. The cloud was so thick, he could no longer see the house or Carrie. A new sound drowned out everything. The sound of hordes of insects eating at once. It sounded like a raging fire, consuming everything in its path. Still, Clarence and his farmhands fought on. By the time Carrie made it back inside the house, she saw a thing of nightmares. The locusts had gotten inside. How? She quickly assessed the situation. There were tiny holes and gaps in walls and around the windows that had to be filled. She took a deep breath. There were just a few more sacks outside. When she dove outside and made for the little stack, her hair and clothes were covered. Not deterred, she grabbed the bags and rushed back inside. Once there, she crushed the locusts she could catch and set about filling the gaps in the walls. She heard whimpering from the bedroom, but her immediate task took precedence. By the time she finished, the house had too many locusts inside, but there wasn't much she could do, so she hustled to the bedroom and made her way under the covers with the children. "I'm so scared," said Helen. "Me, too," said Daniel. Sarah just whimpered. "Children, remember what I said? They can't hurt you. At worst, it's just unpleasant. It will be over before you know it. I've made sure no more can get in, and I'm here with you now. It'll be all right." The children snuggled closer to her, and the four of them waited it out. At long last, the locusts moved on as suddenly as they'd arrived. Clarence surveyed the damage. Devastation, as far as his eye could see in all directions, greeted him. He was ruined. There was no recovering from this, at least not this year. They wouldn't even have food to eat, come winter. He stood there, covered in smoke, locust waste, and tears. The farmhands had worked their hearts out. It would probably be the end for them, too. It would be hard to find work now. Most farmers had done their hiring for the season, and no one had funds to spare. Broken and dejected, the four men walked back to the house. "Boys, I don't know what to tell you. Go home. Be with your families," said Clarence. The young men shook his hand and departed. Clarence stood alone, looking at his home. At least his barn, henhouse, and house still stood. That was something. The door opened, and a few stray locusts flew out. Then, out came Carrie. She was a mess. It was obvious she'd been caught in the great swarm, too. At the same time, she'd never looked more beautiful to him. One tear fell down Clarence's cheek, followed by another. I've failed. I've failed you, me, and the boys. It's over, Carrie. It's over, and we're going to be hungry. I'm so sorry. She walked up to him and wiped away his tears, leaving streaks of black. He wrapped her in his arms and held her tight. All the shyness, tension, and awkwardness of the past melted away. None of that mattered anymore. Nothing mattered anymore. Nothing but Carrie. They stood like this for a long while, giving and receiving the love they both needed so badly, when the three little ones emerged. They tumbled out onto the porch, their eyes wide and their mouths open. Carrie gasped. What is it? Asked Clarence. The garden. Some of it might be all right. Oh Lord, let it be all right. She ran around the house to the garden. It was covered in the feed sacks she had split and laid out and kicked as much dirt as possible over. The sacks gaping through the scattered dirt were tattered and covered with holes. She pulled them off, one after the other, in quick succession. When she finished, the results left Clarence in tears. Against all odds, scraggly bits of the garden had survived. And the dirt was undisturbed in places, so he knew that the root crops were safe. There would be enough food there to see them at least partway through the winter. The coming year would be difficult, no doubt, but now, there was hope. Carrie, he breathed her name, his voice raspy and thick with the lingering smoke. It will help, won't it, Clarence? She asked. What's left of the garden? It will help? It will help, he said. Again, he reached out and grabbed her to him. Sending for her was the best thing he'd ever done in his life. He knew then, with no doubt, that they would make it. He squeezed her even tighter. Yes. Together, they would make it. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.